20 specialists had walked through the doors of the Vance estate, and 20 had walked back out saying the same thing. The last one didn't lower his voice on the way past the staff. There's nothing left to try. He's past helping. All that's left is waiting for him to destroy himself. Upstairs, the man they'd given up on stood alone in the dark at 3 a.m, both hands pressed hard against his skull, telling something only he could hear to stop. Garrison Vance was 38. 3 states bowed to the name he carried. He never raised his voice, never repeated himself, and no one who'd ever crossed him had needed telling twice. But when the rages came, nothing in that house survived them, and the people who worked there had learned a rule nobody ever wrote down when the sound of breaking wood came down from the 3rd floor. You stood still, you looked at the floor, and you waited. Nobody ran, nobody called anyone. There wasn't anyone left to call. Then came the night the storm took the power out, and every lock in that house went quiet, and a night shift maid, who wouldn't speak unless she was spoken to, walked past the one door nobody had been allowed to open in 3 years, and found it open. She hadn't touched a piano in 4 years. She couldn't have told you why she sat down at that one. And the moment the first strange notes drifted up through the house, the most dangerous man in Chicago dropped to his knees on his own floor. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach more people. Share it with someone who needs it tonight. And subscribe, because there's a new story here every week. Now let's get back to the night that Storm came in. Madeline Rhodes had been working the night shift at the Vance estate for 11 days, and in those 11 days, not a single person in the house had asked her name. They called her the night girl. The head chef called her that. The 2 daytime cleaners called her that. And even the duty roster posted in the staff room simply said, night shift, cleaning, with no line for a first or last name. She didn't correct it. What would have been the point, when the woman before her had lasted 6 weeks, and the one before that only 9 days? Her shift began at 8 o'clock at night and ended at 6 a.m, 6 nights a week, $26 an hour, about $1,200 a week after taxes, and she had done the math so many times that the number no longer felt like money. It had become a countdown clock. At 9:40 that night, the phone vibrated in the pocket of her apron, and one look at the screen told her who was calling, because Riverbend only called when something was wrong. She leaned the mop against the wall, stepped into the service stairwell, pulled the door shut behind her, and only then answered. The financial coordinator on the other end spoke in the gentle voice people used when they were about to deliver bad news, and told her that Nora Rhodes's Medicaid application had been decided. It had been denied. Madeline asked why. The woman read out the phrase Madeline had heard 3 times in 3 months, and each time it seemed to weigh a little more than the last. The 5-year look-back rule. 3 years earlier, when Nora was still clear-minded enough to sign her own name, she had transferred the little house in Berwyn to her daughter. She had done it out of love, and she hadn't known that under the rules, any property transferred within 60 months before an application could be treated as a transfer made to avoid medical care costs, leaving the applicant subject to a period of ineligibility. Madeline had sold that house 18 months earlier, and every dollar from the sale had flowed into Riverbend month by month until there was nothing left by April. She asked how much longer the penalty period would last, and the woman told her more than another year. Madeline leaned her back against the cold, concrete wall of the stairwell and asked the next question in the same steady voice. How much did she owe right now? $27,600. 3 consecutive months, unpaid. $9,200 each month. Madeline asked how much time she had. 30 days. After that, under procedure, Riverbend would begin the process of discharging the patient. Madeline thanked her. She meant it, without sarcasm, because the woman was only the person who had been given the job of making that call. Then she hung up. 30 days, at Madeline's wages, meant roughly $5,000. She stood in the stairwell and worked the calculation over 3 times, as if a fourth might somehow produce a different answer. But there was no different answer. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, pushed open the door to the hallway, picked up the mop, and went back to work, because she still had 8 hours left in her shift, and no one was paying her to stand in a stairwell and cry. The storm came down over the North Shore just after midnight, a September wind sweeping hard across Lake Michigan and driving the rain against the windows, as though someone were throwing pebbles at the glass. A little after 1 a.m, the power went out. The entire mansion fell black for the space of a single heartbeat. Then the backup generator roared to life beneath the basement, and the hallway lights returned at half strength, yellow and wavering. But one thing didn't come back with the lights. Throughout the house came a soft sequence of clicks, clean and orderly, one after another, and it took Madeline several seconds to realize she was hearing the magnetic locks release, because the generator powered the lights and refrigerators, but not the security system. The entire house had just unlocked itself. She pushed her supply cart toward the east wing because that night's assignment listed the east corridor, and Madeline followed the schedule. It was the least traveled part of the estate. In 11 days, she had cleaned it 4 times, and hadn't once crossed paths with anyone. At the end of the hallway stood a door. On her first day, the butler, Bennett Shaw, had walked her through the house, pointed to that door, and said in a voice that allowed no questions that the door was not to be opened, cleaned, touched, or even lingered near. No one was allowed inside. He hadn't said why, and Madeline hadn't asked. Tonight, that door stood slightly ajar, open by perhaps 8 inches, enough to reveal a darkness inside deeper than the dim hallway beyond it, while the draft moving along the corridor nudged it inward a fraction before it settled again. Madeline stopped the cart. The proper thing to do was pull the door shut and tell Bennett in the morning. She knew that perfectly well, and she stood there longer than she cared to admit. Then she placed her hand against the door and pushed. The smell reached her first, dry dust and wood sealed away too long, the scent of a place where no fresh air had passed in years. She felt along the wall for a switch and pressed it, but no light came on. This circuit wasn't connected to the generator. Only the lightning beyond the windows gave her enough illumination to see the room. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been stopped. A grand piano stood in the center of the room, its lid still raised, and on the music stand rested a handwritten score left open somewhere in the middle. Beside the bench sat a teacup, long since dried, a brown ring hardened along the bottom. On a small table, a pair of glasses lay neatly folded, the temples pointing outward, arranged the way someone would leave them after taking them off for only a few minutes, expecting to put them back on again. Dust covered everything in the room evenly, 3 years of it, except for the piano keys. Madeline stood perfectly still for a long time. Outside, thunder rolled in one long peal, and then the house sank once more into the steady sound of rain. She hadn't touched a piano in 4 years. She had walked away during her final year at the conservatory when she was 23, closed the lid of the piano in her own home, and never opened it again. After that, she worked 3 jobs at once, and no longer had any reason to. She couldn't explain why tonight felt different. Maybe it was the $27,600. Maybe it was the 30 days. Maybe it was simply because this was the first room in 11 days where no one had passed her as though she were a piece of furniture. Madeline pulled out the bench and sat down. She looked at the sheet of paper open on the stand, and she knew that handwriting. She had seen it thousands of times throughout her life, in practice notebooks, on bills, on little notes stuck to the refrigerator door at home. It was her mother's handwriting. Madeline placed her hands on the keys. The first note sounded wrong. No one had tuned the piano in 3 years. The lower strings had sagged nearly half a step, and the sound came out dry and brittle in the sealed room. Madeline pulled her hands back. She sat still for several seconds, listening to the rain lash the windows, then placed her hands on the keys again. Her fingers were stiff and slow. 4 years without practice meant 4 years for the muscles to forget what they once knew. But this piece was something she didn't need the sheet music for. Her mother had written it when Madeline was in 4th grade, rewriting it again and again over the years without ever being satisfied, and Madeline had heard it fill the little house in Berwyn so many times that it lived inside her hands like an old habit. She played the first 8 measures, then 16, then she forgot where she was. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, something crashed. Madeline didn't hear it, because of the rain and because she was in the middle of the transition. She didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs either. The music room door flew open and slammed against the wall hard enough to make the hinges shriek, and Madeline turned just in time to see a man standing in the doorway, his body filling the entire frame. She sprang to her feet. The piano bench tipped backward and crashed to the floor. The man wasn't looking at her. He was looking through her, toward someplace behind her, both hands already clenched into fists. Then he seized the edge of the door and pulled. The wood cracked first, followed by the sound of nails ripping free from the wall. He yanked again. The entire strip of molding tore away from the frame, bringing a chunk of white plaster with it, and he threw it to the floor. He swept one arm across the small table beside the door. The old teacup shattered. The glasses flew against the baseboard. He drove his forearm into the wooden door once, then twice, until a long crack split the panel from top to bottom. Madeline backed away until her spine struck the side of the piano, and there was nowhere left to go. She stood there without screaming, without running. He never moved toward her. From beginning to end, he didn't take a single step in her direction. He only stood amid the splintered wood, both hands pressed hard against the sides of his head, telling something in the empty air to be quiet, his voice so hoarse it barely formed a sound. Then his knees gave way. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, folding in on himself, his forehead touching the boards, his hands still clamped around his head, his entire back shuddering with each breath like a man who had just been dragged out from underwater. Madeline didn't move. She had heard these crashes for 11 nights straight, from the kitchen below, from the hallways, from the staff room, but she had never seen them happen, and she had never imagined they ended like this. At that moment, there was only one thought in her mind, perfectly clear and painfully ordinary. She had just lost her job, and her mother had 30 days left. She bent down, picked up the glasses, and placed them back on the small table, even though the table itself had been knocked sideways. She meant to leave. She had taken 2 steps toward the door when a voice came from the floor. "Don't stop." 3 words, not an order, and not exactly a plea, but something suspended between the two, the kind of thing a person said only after there was no dignity left to protect. Madeline stopped. She looked down at the man curled on the floor of his own house, then at the broken doorway, then at the piano. She could walk out. No one in this house even knew her name. In the morning, she could take her bag and leave, and no one would come looking for her. She righted the piano bench and sat down. She began again from the first measure. This time she played more slowly, more gently, holding the pedal a little longer so the out-of-tune notes wouldn't sound quite so harsh. After about a minute, the breathing behind her changed. The breaths grew longer. The spaces between them widened. She didn't turn around. She played through the middle section, through the modulation her mother had once revised 7 times on the same page, and then she came to the place she always had to come to. The piece had no ending. Her mother had written 3 pages, and then stopped in the middle of a measure. It didn't end on a chord that closed the music. It ended on a suspended chord waiting for an answer that had never been written. Throughout Madeline's childhood, every time she heard it reach that point, she had felt a quiet discomfort, like missing a stair in the dark. She played to that measure, and her fingers stopped because there was nothing left to play. The final sound lingered, then faded into the room. Nothing came after it. Madeline sat with both hands resting on the keys. Then she turned around. The man was asleep. He lay on his side on the hardwood floor, among the broken pieces of the doorframe. One arm still folded beneath his head, his chest rising and falling evenly. Madeline remained seated for a long time, afraid to stand, because the bench might make a sound. She looked at the ruined doorway, at the fallen plaster, at the shattered teacup, and she understood that by morning she would have to answer for all of it. Finally, she rose as quietly as she could. She took off her uniform jacket and draped it over his shoulders. Then she left the room, pulled at the door that could no longer close, and went downstairs to the kitchen to sit out the rest of her shift. Bennett Shaw found them at 5:10 in the morning, when he made his rounds to inspect the storm damage. He stopped at the far end of the east hallway and looked into the room through the doorway that no longer had a door. He stood there for a very long time. Madeline heard his footsteps coming back toward the kitchen and rose to her feet, already rehearsing an apology in her head. But the butler didn't ask about the door. He didn't ask about the piano. His face had gone completely white, and his voice trembled in a way no one could fake. He asked her only one question. How long had he been lying there? Madeline said about 3 hours. Bennett braced one hand against the edge of the kitchen table. Then he said, almost to himself, that in 3 years, he had never once seen him sleep. Madeline's shift ended at 6 o'clock, but she didn't leave. She stayed in the staff room with her handbag resting on her lap because she knew this couldn't end with her simply walking out the back door the way she did every other morning. At 7:15, Bennett Shaw appeared in the doorway and said that he wanted to see her. He didn't say anything else. He led her upstairs to the 2nd floor, through a hallway she had never been permitted to clean, and stopped in front of a dark wooden door. Before he knocked, he turned and looked at her for a second. And the expression in his eyes wasn't the expression of a man escorting someone to receive a new assignment. He knocked twice, opened the door for her, and didn't follow her inside. Garrison Vance stood with his back to the windows. He had changed clothes, his hair was still wet, and a strip of white gauze was wrapped around his right forearm from the wrist to just below the elbow. He didn't turn around immediately. Madeline stood 2 steps inside the doorway, both hands tightening around the strap of her bag. She had already prepared 3 sentences in her head. One was an apology. One was an offer to pay for the damaged door by having the cost taken gradually out of her wages. And one was a plea that he not report her to the staffing agency, because if it went into her record, she wouldn't be able to find another job. She didn't get the chance to say any of them. Garrison turned and asked where she had learned that piece of music. His voice wasn't loud. That was what made it frightening. Madeline said she had learned it at home. He looked at her and waited. She continued, saying she had known it since childhood, not from a book, but from hearing it over and over in her house for years. He asked who had played it in her home. She said her mother. Not played it, she corrected herself, but written it. Her mother was the one who had composed it. A silence followed that sentence, longer than an ordinary silence, and Madeline could clearly hear the vacuum cleaner running downstairs. Garrison asked his second question. What was her mother's name? Nora Rhodes, she said. He repeated the name once, very softly, not as though asking her to confirm it, but as if he were setting it down somewhere in his mind. Then he asked what she had done for a living. Madeline said her mother had taught piano. 40 years, mostly out of their home in Berwyn, teaching neighborhood children and a few adults who were returning to lessons. She had also taught part-time at a community school near Cermak Avenue for about 15 years. She wrote music too, but she had never published or registered any of it. She always said her music was meant for teaching, not for selling. When Madeline finished, she realized she had said far more than necessary, and she fell silent. Garrison asked his third question. Was she still alive? Madeline said yes. He waited. She told him her mother was 58 years old and had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 4 years earlier, when she was 54. At first, it had only been forgetting students' names, then forgetting the way home from the store, and then one evening, she had sat in front of her own piano for an hour without lifting the lid because she couldn't remember what was inside it. Madeline said her mother now lived in a memory care facility called Riverbend, west of the city. He asked whether she still recognized her. Madeline said no, not for 2 years. Her mother still spoke to her, still asked whether she was cold, sometimes even called her teacher, but she didn't know Madeline was her daughter. She said it in the flat, practiced voice of someone who had been forced to answer the same question for too many administrative employees, and only then did she realize she had just spoken aloud something she hadn't told anyone at any workplace in 4 years. Garrison didn't ask another question. He looked at her for several more seconds, his expression unchanged, then picked up the phone from the desk and walked out of the room. He passed within less than a step of her. He didn't tell her she could go. He didn't tell her she was fired. He didn't say a single word about the door, the shattered teacup, the fact that she had entered a room everyone in the house had been forbidden to enter, or the fact that she had laid her jacket over his shoulders at 4 a.m. The door closed behind him, and Madeline stood alone in the room, still gripping the strap of her bag. She stepped into the hallway. Bennett Shaw was still there, both hands clasped behind his back out of habit. He asked whether she was all right. Madeline said, "He didn't tell me anything. He asked me 3 questions and walked out. I don't even know whether I still have a job." Bennett looked toward the end of the hallway where Garrison had disappeared, then told her she ought to be glad, because he only killed time with people he didn't care about. Madeline didn't understand what he meant. She was about to ask. Bennett had already turned away. He had taken several steps when he stopped, and added that the repair crew would arrive after 10 o'clock to rebuild the music room doorframe, and that she was still expected to report for her shift at 8 that night, same as always. He said it like an order, not good news. Madeline walked to the bus stop on Deer Path beneath a sky still heavy with storm clouds. She had $41 in her bag, and today was day 2 of 30. She boarded the bus, sat down, and didn't realize something until they had passed beyond Highland Park. He had asked her mother's name. He had asked her mother's name, asked where she had taught, asked how many years she had taught there. From the beginning of that conversation to the end, the man had never once asked Madeline's name. At 8 o'clock that night, Madeline reported for her shift as usual, and Bennett Shaw was already waiting in the staff room. He handed her a single sheet of paper printed on one side. It was an amendment to her contract, prepared by the legal department, with a blank space for her signature. He told her to read it and not to rush. The contents were very short. Her night cleaning duties would remain the same, her hours would remain the same, and her pay would remain the same. One clause had been added, stating that the signer would be present in the music room each night during a designated period and would play music at the homeowner's request. It didn't specify what she was supposed to play. It didn't specify for how long. Madeline finished reading and looked up to ask who would be in the room while she played. Bennett said that wasn't part of the contract. She asked what would happen if last night happened again. He said that if last night happened again, she should do exactly what she had done last night. Then he pointed to the final line on the page, the line stating the additional compensation for the extra duty, and told her he wanted her to read that line carefully. The number printed there was $40,000, a single payment due immediately upon signing. Madeline read it 3 times to make sure she hadn't miscounted the zeros. $40,000, $27,600 would erase the entire debt at Riverbend, and what remained would keep her mother there for nearly another 3 months. The 30-day countdown inside her head could disappear tonight. She stood very still for a long time with the paper in her hands. Bennett didn't hurry her. Then she asked whether he was here. Bennett said he was in the study. Madeline said she wanted to speak to him directly. The butler looked at her for a moment, then led her upstairs. Garrison was sitting behind his desk, with his sleeves rolled up, the bandage from the day before replaced by a smaller dressing. He didn't look surprised to see her. Madeline placed the paper on the desk, turned it around so it faced him properly, and said she would agree to play. Every night, at any hour, for as long as he wanted to listen. Then she said she wouldn't accept the money. Garrison looked down at the page. He asked whether she understood how much it was. She said she knew exactly how much it was, and she knew exactly what it would solve for her. He asked why. Then, Madeline said because that piece belonged to her mother. She said her mother had never sold it, and had never allowed anyone to pay to hear it, not even during the years when their family had been so short on money that they had to split the electric bill into 2 payments. She said that if she accepted $40,000 to play that piece, she would be the first person in their family to do such a thing, and her mother was no longer clear-minded enough to know about it and stop her. She said she would still clean, and still accept her cleaning wages, because that was the job she had been hired to do. But the other part, no. When she finished, she fell silent, and didn't add a single word to defend her decision. Garrison Vance said nothing. He sat there looking at the paper on the desk, and the silence lasted so long that Madeline began to hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the room. She had stood in front of enough powerful men to know that this kind of silence usually came just before anger. The anger never came. He reached for a pen, drew a line through the additional compensation clause, placed his initials beside the strike-through, and pushed the paper back toward her. 11 o'clock, he said. Only those 2 words. Madeline signed her name in the blank space and left the room. She finished the rest of the second-floor hallway, then went down to the music room at exactly 11. The door frame had been replaced, the new wood still lighter than the surrounding wall, and the workers had cleared away every piece of debris. The piano had been tuned. She didn't ask who had arranged for a piano tuner to come in less than a day. She sat down and played. She played her mother's piece from the beginning, and as always, it stopped at that suspended chord with nothing after it. She remained seated for a while longer, then closed the piano lid. She didn't see anyone the entire evening, but when she stepped into the hallway, she noticed that the light at the far end had just gone dark, and she understood that someone had been standing there. By the 4th day, the entire house knew. No one said anything directly to her. They said it after she had just walked away. In the kitchen, someone told the daytime cleaners that the night girl had been allowed into the music room, even though a maid who had worked there for 12 years had never been permitted to set foot inside. Someone said she had to be getting extra money. She had to be, because otherwise no one would be foolish enough to stay in this house. Someone else said she had refused the money, and that refusing money made her even more suspicious, because no one in this house had ever refused anything before. The head chef said something shorter than all the rest. She'll end up like the others. Just wait. Madeline heard almost all of it. Through the kitchen door, through the stairwell, through the way people stopped talking whenever she walked into a room. She didn't explain herself to anyone. There was nothing to explain. All she had was a contract with the final line crossed out, and an 11 o'clock appointment each night. And by that 4th day, in the house where everyone was talking about her, there still wasn't a single person who had asked her name, not even the man who had asked her to play the piano for him every night. On the 5th night, Madeline was mopping the first-floor hallway when she heard laughter. Real laughter. Loud and easy. The kind of sound she had never once heard inside this house. She looked up and saw a middle-aged man coming in through the front door carrying 2 paper bags, calling upstairs as he walked that if someone didn't come down within 30 seconds, he was going to eat all the pastries himself. He saw Madeline, stopped, and said hello, in the tone of someone greeting a guest rather than a member of the staff. Then he set one of the bags on the kitchen table and said it was filled with cannoli from Taylor Street, that as usual he had bought too many, so anyone who was hungry should help themselves. The head chef came out to take the bag, and Madeline noticed that the woman smiled, also for the first time. That was Emmett Kerr. Madeline learned his name half an hour later when she heard the 2 daytime cleaners talking about him. He was 46 years old, the second most powerful man in the house, and according to them, the only person alive who could walk into the study without knocking. Garrison came downstairs. Emmett hugged him, slapped him twice on the shoulder, called him little brother, asked whether he had eaten anything, and without waiting for an answer went to get a plate himself. Madeline stood at the far end of the hallway with the mop in her hands and watched, because it was the strangest thing she had seen since coming to the estate. Everyone in this house treated Garrison Vance as though he were something fragile and dangerous at the same time. This man didn't. This man sat across from him, pulled out a chair with his foot, pushed a stack of papers aside to make room for the plate of pastries, and spoke to him the way one person spoke to another ordinary human being. Before leaving that night, Emmett stopped beside Madeline, thanked her for staying on the night shift, then took out his wallet and offered her a $100 bill, telling her to use it for coffee because working nights was the hardest job in the house. Madeline refused. He laughed and said she was the first person in this house who had ever refused his money, then put his wallet away and wished her a good night. The next day, exactly 24 hours after he had first laid eyes on her, Emmett Kerr placed a file on the desk in Garrison's study. He made no attempt to hide what he had done. He said plainly that he had ordered someone to look into the night girl the evening before, because in 11 years he had never seen a stranger allowed into that room, and if something went wrong, people would come asking him questions before they asked anyone else. He said he would have done the same thing with anyone. Then he pushed the file across the desk. Madeline Rhodes, 27 years old, born and raised in Berwyn, Illinois, attended the DePaul School of Music, majoring in piano performance, left in the middle of her final year 4 years earlier, with family circumstances listed in the school records as the reason. Since then, she had worked 9 different jobs, most of them night shifts, and none had lasted longer than 14 months. No criminal record, no citations except 2 parking tickets from 5 years earlier, no credit card debt because she had no credit cards, $312 remaining in her bank account, sold a house in Berwyn 18 months earlier, with every dollar from the sale transferred directly to a memory care facility called Riverbend, paid out steadily month after month until the money was gone. Mother, Nora Rhodes, 58 years old, currently living at that facility. Father left when Madeline was 7 and had made no contact since. No siblings, no fiancé, no boyfriend, no one. Emmett said she was completely clean. He said he had read hundreds of files like this and had never seen one so clean enough that it made him feel a little sad. Then he added that the girl had turned down his $100 the night before, and he thought Garrison ought to know that. Garrison read the entire file, closed it, and said nothing. On Thursday afternoon, Dr. Corwin Ashby came for his regular examination, just as he had every 2 weeks for the past 3 years. He was 64 years old, carried a leather case worn at the corners, and remained alone with Garrison for exactly 40 minutes. When he came out, he handed Bennett Shaw a new prescription, instructed the butler to adjust the evening dosage beginning the next day, and said the symptoms had worsened during the most recent episode, so the dose needed to be increased. Emmett Kerr was waiting in the hall. He asked the doctor how things looked, and the concern in his voice was genuine. Ashby took off his glasses and wiped them, then said he would speak plainly because Emmett was family. He said the prognosis wasn't good. He said he had followed this case for 3 years, had brought in 19 other colleagues for consultations, and none of them had been able to offer anything new. He said that at some point, the family would have to consider guardianship, because allowing someone in this condition to retain complete decision-making authority was extremely dangerous, first and foremost to the man himself. Emmett Kerr nodded. Sloane Whitaker was standing about 5 steps away, putting papers into her briefcase after a meeting with the legal department, and she looked up at that exact moment. She had been the family's attorney for 6 years. 6 years sitting in meetings. 6 years watching how people reacted when they heard bad news. And she knew very well how long it took a person to absorb a sentence as long as the one the doctor had just spoken. Emmett Kerr nodded sooner than that. Only a beat too soon. Sloane took a notebook from her briefcase, wrote down the date, the time, and the word guardianship, then closed her briefcase and walked out to her car. She told no one. On the first night after signing the contract, Madeline went down to the music room at 11 o'clock and played for an empty room. When she stepped into the hallway afterward, the light at the far end had just gone out. The second night was the same, and so was the third. And she began to grow accustomed to it the way a person grew accustomed to a shift at work. On the fourth night, she looked up midway through the piece and saw him standing in the doorway. He didn't come inside. He remained just beyond the threshold, one shoulder resting against the newly replaced wood, both hands in his trouser pockets. Madeline didn't stop playing, and she didn't look up a second time. By the time she finished, the doorway was empty. On the fifth night, he was there again in exactly the same place, and this time he stayed until she closed the piano lid. On the sixth night, he brought a cup of something with him and finished it while he stood listening. Nothing changed on the seventh or eighth night. On the ninth night, when Madeline entered the room, he was already inside. He was sitting on the hardwood floor, with his back against the base of the left wall, one knee raised, his head tilted back against the wall. She walked past him, sat down, and played as she did every night. When she finished, he was still sitting in the same position with his eyes closed. She left the room and pulled the door shut behind her. On the 10th night, he sat in the same place, but had moved a little closer. On the 11th, a little closer still. On the 12th night, there was an ashtray beside his foot with 3 cigarette butts in it. And by the 13th night, the ashtray was gone. On the 14th night, Madeline walked in and found him sitting on the piano bench. He occupied the far left end, leaving exactly half the bench open on the right, both hands resting on his thighs, not touching the keys. She paused for a second, then sat down on the remaining half. Their shoulders were about 8 inches apart. She played, and he didn't move for the entire piece. When her fingers stopped on the final note, he stood and walked out without saying anything. On the 15th night, he sat in exactly the same place again. On the 16th, he arrived before she did, and the bench had already been pulled out. On the 17th night, while she was playing, something fell on the 3rd floor because wind had blown through an open window, and Madeline saw his entire body go rigid for a single beat before slowly relaxing again. She didn't stop playing. He didn't stand up. On the 18th night, Bennett Shaw was standing in the hallway when she came out, and he said nothing at all. He only gave her a single nod. On the 19th night, Madeline noticed that the bandage on Garrison's forearm had been removed completely, leaving only a faint scar running along the muscle. On the 20th night, he arrived about 10 minutes later than usual, and when he sat down, he said only one thing: "Go ahead and start." It was only the second time he had spoken to her since the night of the storm. The 21st night was a Tuesday. The cold had come early, and Madeline went to work wearing 2 pairs of socks because the left toe of her shoe had split open. She finished cleaning the first floor, went up to the music room at 11 o'clock, and found him sitting at the left end of the bench, just as he had for the previous 14 nights. She sat down, she placed her hands on the keys, and was about to begin when he spoke. He asked her what her name was. Madeline lowered both hands back into her lap. In the 21 days she had worked in this house, it was the first question anyone had asked that contained the word "you" in the way she understood it to mean her. She turned and looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring straight ahead at the piano lid, and she realized he was genuinely waiting for an answer, rather than asking merely for the sake of asking. "Madeline Rhodes," she said. She gave him her full name, clearly and without rushing, the way a person said their name at a hospital admissions desk. Garrison Vance repeated it once. He said it very softly, without turning toward her, and he added nothing afterward. Then he fell silent. Madeline waited. She waited for another question, or an explanation of why it had taken him until today to ask, or anything at all that might connect one moment to the next. Nothing came. He remained still with both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed on the piano lid, and the room was so quiet that she could hear the heating system running beneath the floor. Finally, she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. That night, she played longer than she ever had before, not because he asked her to, but because she didn't know what else to do with the silence between them. When she stopped, he was still sitting there. She stood, closed the piano lid, and had almost reached the door when she heard him speak behind her. "Tomorrow, still 11 o'clock. She said yes. Then she stepped into the hallway, closed the door, and stood there for a moment with her hand still resting on the knob. Downstairs, the kitchen lights were already off, and the only sound left in the house was the wind coming off the lake. She went down, collected her coat from the staff room, and walked out through the gate shortly before 6 in the morning. She had $312 in her bag, and as she rode the bus home, she realized how much had shifted since that first rainy night when the countdown had begun. Madeline began keeping notes on the 22nd night, and she started for a very ordinary reason. There was an episode that night, the fourth since she had arrived, and the next morning, when the two daytime cleaners asked each other how many times it had happened that month, neither of them could remember. They only remembered that lately it seemed to be happening more often. Madeline bought a small notebook at the drugstore near the bus stop for $1.99, and she recorded things in the only way she knew, the same way her mother had once kept her teaching records, 1 entry per line, no commentary, date, starting time, how long it lasted, what had been damaged, and one final column she labeled "What Happened Before," where she wrote down everything that had taken place in the house during the previous 2 days, who came, who left, whether there had been visitors, what had been eaten, how many hours he had slept. After 3 weeks, she had 11 entries. September 15th, 11:40 at night, lasted about 20 minutes. 1 third-floor window and 1 chair broken. 2 days earlier, Dr. Ashby had come for an examination. September 18th, 3:15 in the morning. About 10 minutes. Only struck the wall. Nothing damaged. No visitors beforehand. September 29th, midnight. Nearly 40 minutes. 1 door and 1 small cabinet damaged. A day and a half earlier, Dr. Ashby had come for an examination. October 2nd, 2 o'clock in the morning. Brief. Nothing damaged. No visitors beforehand. October 13th, 11 o'clock at night. More than 30 minutes. 40 hours earlier, Dr. Ashby had come for an examination. Madeline wasn't trying to discover anything. She wrote it down so she wouldn't forget, because she was the only person in the house who was awake through the entire night, and she thought that if anyone ever asked, someone ought to be able to answer. But when she reached the 9th entry, sitting on the number 221 bus at 7 o'clock in the morning, and reading the notebook again from the beginning, she saw it. The mild episodes were scattered, with no pattern at all. The severe ones were different. Every severe episode fell between roughly 36 and 48 hours after Dr. Ashby left the house. There wasn't a single exception among the 11 entries. Madeline read them again, then took out a pen and marked the 4 lines that mentioned the doctor's name and the 4 entries immediately below them. She counted the number of hours between each pair. 38, 42, 36, 40. She sat on the bus with the notebook open across her lap until she had gone 2 stops past her own. She knew what people in the house said about his condition. They said the illness was getting worse, so the dosage had to be increased. The doctor said it, Bennett repeated it, and everyone in the house believed it. But if the illness were truly getting worse, the episodes should have become steadily more frequent. They shouldn't have fallen neatly inside the same window of time every time one particular man walked out the door carrying a leather case. Madeline closed the notebook and thought about telling someone. She thought of Bennett Shaw first, then dismissed the idea, because Bennett was the one who received the prescriptions and adjusted the dosage according to the doctor's instructions, and he had been doing it for 3 years. She thought of the man named Emmett Kerr, the only person in the house who spoke to her as though she were a human being, then imagined what she would actually say to him, that she was the night cleaner, that she had a notebook that cost $1.99, and that she believed the doctor who had been treating this case for 3 years, who had brought 19 other specialists in for consultation, was doing something wrong. She thought about telling Garrison Vance directly, and she pictured the moment clearly enough to know exactly how terrible it would be. She had 11 handwritten lines in a notebook. He had 20 pages of diagnoses signed by 20 specialists. In this house, no one had even asked her name until 3 nights ago. Madeline pushed the notebook down into the bottom of her handbag beneath the lining and told no one. But every night, she kept writing. The final call came on October 23rd at 4:10 in the afternoon, while she was standing in line at the laundromat on Cermak Road. It was the same financial coordinator from Riverbend, the same gentle voice, but this time she spoke much more briefly. She said Nora Rhodes's account had been transferred to collections, and under procedure, That department no longer had the authority to grant extensions. She said the current balance was $36,800 after the October charges had been added. She said 21 days of the 30-day deadline had already passed. 9 days remained. After 9 days, if no payment was made, the facility would begin discharge proceedings and release the patient into the care of her legal guardian, her daughter. Madeline asked what would happen if she had nowhere to take her mother. The woman was silent for a moment, then said that was a question Madeline should ask an attorney, and that she was truly sorry. Madeline thanked her, just as she had the first time. She took her clothes out of the dryer, folded them, put them into bags, and walked to the bus stop so she could make her 8 o'clock shift. Along the way, she repeated the number 36,800 in her head, and then she repeated the number 40,000, the amount she had crossed out with her own hand 17 days earlier. She didn't regret it, but she stood on the corner of Cermak Road, holding 2 bags of laundry long enough to watch 2 buses pass without getting on either one. Riverbend called again on the morning of the 3rd day after that, at 9:20, just as Madeline had reached her apartment and before she had even taken off her shoes. This time it wasn't the financial coordinator but someone else, and her voice carried the cheerful tone people only used when they had good news to deliver. She said Nora Rhodes's account had been paid in full. Madeline asked what exactly in full meant. The woman said it meant the entire $36,800 had been paid, along with 12 months of care in advance, for a total of $147,200, transferred in a single payment the previous afternoon, and that the account had been withdrawn from collections. Madeline asked who had sent the money. The woman said the sender had requested anonymity. The transaction had gone through a law office in the Loop, and under policy the facility couldn't provide any further information. Madeline thanked her, ended the call, sat on the edge of her bed for exactly 1 minute, then put her shoes back on and walked to the bus stop. She arrived at the Vance estate at 11 o'clock in the morning, an hour when she should have been asleep, went straight in through the staff entrance, and headed upstairs to the 2nd floor. Bennett Shaw rose from his desk as though he meant to say something, but she walked past him. She knocked twice on the study door and opened it without waiting. Garrison Vance was seated with a stack of files and a man she had never seen before. He looked up, then he closed the file in front of him and told the other man to leave. Madeline stood in the middle of the room and asked whether he had paid for her mother's care. He said yes. She asked why, after she had made it clear that she wouldn't accept the money. He said she had refused $40,000 in exchange for playing the piano, and he had respected that. He had crossed it out in front of her. This had nothing to do with her contract. Madeline said it did have something to do with her, because if it weren't for her, he would never even have known what Riverbend was. She said she didn't want to owe him $147,200, because at her wages, it would take 19 years to pay back, and she didn't want to owe anyone in this house anything. Garrison let her finish. Then he said, "I didn't pay it for you." He said, "I paid it for her." Madeline went still. He said she had taught piano for 40 years and had never taken money for that piece, because Madeline herself had told him so. He said that piece was now being played in his house every night, and there was no way for him to repay the person who had written it except this. He said she could call it a debt if she wanted, but it wasn't a debt, and if she quit tomorrow, the money would still remain exactly where it was. Madeline sat down in the chair across from his desk, not because she had been invited to, but because her legs were tired. She sat there quietly for a while, then said thank you. It was the first time the two of them had ever spoken for more than 3 sentences. He asked how her mother was now. Madeline said she was still physically healthy, still able to feed herself, still able to walk with a walker. She said her mother still talked, still asked people whether they were cold, still reminded students to keep their wrists straight. Then she said something she had never put into words this way for anyone before. She said her mother still sat there in the same chair beside the window and looked exactly as she always had, but she wasn't really there anymore. She said she had spent hundreds of afternoons sitting beside that chair, and the hardest part wasn't that her mother forgot. The hardest part was that she was still there for Madeline to watch her forgetting. Garrison listened to all of it. Then he said, "So you're mourning someone who's still alive." Madeline looked up at him. She said, "And you're mourning someone you won't allow yourself to bury." The room fell silent. He didn't answer that. He looked down at the surface of the desk for a while, then said her name was Vivian. That was all he said. Madeline didn't ask anything else. She stood, told him she would still report for her shift at 8 that night, then left. She went downstairs by the west staircase, and out through the garage because workers were repairing the staff entrance that day. Sloane Whitaker was standing beside her car with her keys in one hand, and it was obvious she had been waiting. She asked Madeline whether she had a few minutes. Madeline said she was about to miss her bus. Sloane said then she would make it brief. She said she had been the family's attorney for 6 years, and in those 6 years, she had watched quite a few people walk into this house, believing they were helping someone. She asked Madeline whether she knew why the 2 night cleaners before her had left. Madeline said no. Sloane said she didn't know either, and that was exactly the problem. She said the matter of Madeline's mother's care had been resolved. Everyone in the house knew it. And she said it in the tone of someone reading a line from a file, rather than passing along gossip. She said Madeline was no longer being forced to stay. She said she advised her to leave. Not next week, not after she found another job, but as soon as possible. Madeline asked why. Sloane opened the car door, and for exactly 1 second before getting in, she looked back at the house, up toward the 2nd floor, then toward the east entrance. She said because something was about to happen in this house, and when it did, the people standing closest would be the ones pulled into it, and Madeline was standing much closer than she realized. Then she closed the car door and drove away. That night, Madeline went down to the music room at 11 o'clock, and he was already sitting at the left end of the bench. She sat down on the other half, placed her hands on the keys, and he said, "Wait." He said not to play yet tonight. Madeline lowered her hands into her lap and waited. He sat staring at the piano lid for a long time, before asking whether she knew why this room had been locked for 3 years. She said she had heard people in the house speculate, but no one knew for certain. He said no one knew for certain because he had never told anyone. Then he told her. He said his wife's name was Vivienne. She had been 33 when she died, and she had studied piano since childhood but had never played for anyone except him. He said she played that piece more often than all the others combined, and he had never asked where it came from, or even what it was called. He said he had simply assumed it was some old composition, and that had been his mistake, one among many. He said she used it to call him home. Madeline asked what he meant by call him home. He said that during the last 3 years, he was hardly ever there. He left at 6 in the morning and came back after midnight. Some weeks he didn't eat a single meal with her, and every time she asked whether he would be home that night, he said yes, and then he didn't come home. He said eventually she stopped asking. Instead, she began doing something else. She would call him, and when he answered, she wouldn't say anything. She would set the phone on the piano lid, sit down, and play that piece. He said the first time she did it, he actually left his meeting and went home. The second time, he went home too. The third time, he came home an hour later. After that, it happened less and less. He said she never blamed him for it. Not once. She would simply call, play the piece all the way through, hang up, and the next day she would speak to him as though nothing had happened. Madeline asked how many times she had done that. He said he hadn't counted. He said he wished he had. Then he told her about that night. He said it was November 14th, 3 years earlier. He was in a meeting on the 41st floor of a building in the Loop. There were 7 people in the room, and it was a meeting he had spent 18 months preparing for. He said his phone vibrated at 9:22 that night. He saw her name on the screen and intended to let it ring until it stopped. But he answered anyway. Right in the middle of a sentence, someone across the table was still speaking. He said he put the phone to his ear and heard a recording of the piano playing through the line she was sitting in her car in the garage downstairs, playing the recording she had saved on her phone. He recognized the piece immediately, and he knew exactly what she was trying to tell him because it was the only way she had left. He said he listened to exactly 4 measures. Then he spoke 2 words into the phone. Not now. He said he didn't raise his voice, didn't sound angry, didn't explain. He simply said those 2 words, ended the call, and placed the phone face down on the table so the screen wouldn't light up again. Then he turned back to the meeting and continued the sentence he had been saying before the call. Then he fell silent. Madeline didn't ask anything. He said that 90 seconds later, her car exploded in the underground parking garage beneath that very building. He said he knew the 90 seconds were exact because the police had matched the call log against the parking garage footage, and they had given him a printout showing 2 timestamps exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds apart, and he still kept that piece of paper. He said that afterward, he remained sitting in the meeting room for another 40 minutes. Madeline sat perfectly still. She didn't say a word. She didn't tell him that he couldn't have known. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She didn't say any of the things other people had surely been telling him for the past 3 years. He continued, his voice still as flat as it had been at the beginning. He said people assumed that when he heard that piece, it made him remember her. He said that wasn't true. He remembered her all the time. He didn't need music for that. What the piece did was take him back to those exact 90 seconds. Every time, without missing a single second. He said it wasn't a memory. It was the sound of the last time he chose that meeting room instead of choosing her. And that last time was the one choice in his life he could never go back and correct. Then he said he had ordered this room locked that same night and had never opened it again. He said that over the past 3 years, 20 people had sat across from him and asked what voices he heard inside his head. They asked whether he heard anyone speaking to him, whether he heard anyone giving him orders, and he had answered, no, 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 over and over again. He said not one of those 20 people had ever asked him what he heard. He said that on those nights she had seen in this house, including the night she had stood in this room with a mop in her hand, there had been no voices inside his head at all. There had been 4 measures of music, and the 2 words he had spoken, and a silence lasting 90 seconds that he had never found a way to walk out of. Then he told her to play. Madeline placed her hands on the keys and began. She played more slowly than she had on any other night. He sat motionless beside her, never moving once, and when the piece stopped on that suspended chord with nothing after it, he was still sitting there, his eyes open, staring straight ahead. On Sunday afternoon, Madeline took 2 buses and a Blue Line train to Riverbend. She went because she went every Sunday, but this time she brought something with her. Inside her handbag were 3 photocopied pages of handwritten music that Bennett had allowed her to copy from the original resting on the music stand, and she carried them without knowing exactly what she intended to do with them. Nora Rhodes was sitting in the chair beside the window as she did every Sunday, both hands resting open in her lap, looking out across the lawn. Madeline pulled up a chair beside her and said hello. Nora turned, smiled politely, and asked whether Madeline was someone new who worked there, because she had never seen her before. Madeline said yes. She had learned to say yes 2 years earlier, because every other answer frightened her mother. She sat there for about 40 minutes, talking about the weather, talking about the bus ride, straightening the thin blanket across Nora's lap. Then she took out the photocopied pages, laid them across her own knees, and smoothed them flat. She didn't show them to her mother. She only wanted to look at that handwriting while sitting beside the woman who had written it. Nora looked down. She stared at the pages for several seconds, and something changed in her face. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't recognition exactly. It looked more like the expression of someone who had just heard her name being called from the next room. Then she turned and said, "Madeline." She called her by the right name. She said, "Madeline, you've tilted it. Keep it straight." Madeline couldn't breathe for 1 full beat. For 2 years, her mother had called her teacher, nurse, the girl next door, and once by the name of some former student named Catherine. Not once had she gotten it right. Madeline said, "Yes, Mom." She managed those 2 words before her voice broke, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek to hold herself together. Nora reached out and touched the edge of the paper. She said it wasn't finished. She said, "I stopped there years ago. I could never figure out the ending. The ending is difficult." Then she went quiet for a moment, her eyes still on the page, and she said, "Vivian." Madeline sat upright. Nora said, "The girl sent me the box." She said, "I put it away. I promised her." Madeline asked, "What box, Mom?" Nora didn't answer. She said, "I promised her," and her voice was clear and firm, the voice of someone repeating something she had taken great care not to forget. Madeline asked where she had put it. Nora turned and looked at her, and then it was gone. Madeline saw the exact moment it disappeared, because her mother's eyes didn't change direction, only depth. Nora smiled politely again and asked whether Madeline was cold, because the wind outside was very strong. Madeline said she wasn't cold. Nora nodded, turned back toward the window, and her hand slipped away from the edge of the paper. The entire thing had lasted less than 2 minutes. Madeline stayed for another hour. During that hour, she said Vivian's name 3 more times, each time in a different way, and all 3 times Nora looked at her with the courteous expression of someone who had no idea who she was talking about. On the way home, Madeline sat in the last car of the Blue Line train and thought it through again. She thought about how her mother had taught piano for 40 years, mostly from their home, teaching neighborhood children around Berwyn and a few adults who had decided to learn again. along with 15 years of part-time teaching at the community school near Cermak Avenue. She thought about how many students had passed through their living room. Hundreds of them. Names she couldn't remember even a tenth of. She thought about how her mother had never published that piece, never registered it, never given anyone a copy, except by leaving the handwritten pages open on the piano stand at home, where her students could see them. Then she thought about what Garrison had told her 3 nights earlier, that his wife had studied piano since childhood, but had never played for anyone except him, and that he had never asked where the piece came from. Madeline straightened in her seat. The only way an unpublished piece written in Berwyn could have ended up in the hands of a woman living in Lake Forest was if that woman had once sat in Madeline's living room. She took out her phone, typed Vivian Vance into the search field, and opened the first article that appeared. Vivian Vance, née Ashford, born in Oak Park, Illinois, attended Oak Park and River Forest High School, studied art history in college. The article included a photograph of her at a charity event, dark-haired and smiling beside her husband. Madeline enlarged the face and stared at it for a long time. She didn't recognize her. Madeline had left home for boarding school during high school, then gone on to the conservatory, and throughout those years her mother had continued teaching steadily at home, while Madeline only came back on weekends. There had been hundreds of faces she had never taken the time to notice, but her mother remembered. She had forgotten her own daughter's name for 2 years, forgotten that she had ever owned a piano, and she still remembered Vivian. She remembered her clearly enough to repeat that she had made a promise. The train pulled into the station. The doors opened, and Madeline remained sitting there with the phone in her hand until someone reminded her that this was the last stop. She walked back to her apartment through the dark, and for the entire way home there was only one question in her mind. Where would a person who had forgotten almost everything hide something so that even she herself could still find it again? Madeline found the answer at 4 o'clock in the morning, sitting on the floor of her apartment with the cardboard box that held every document belonging to her mother. She went through it for the 3rd time that night, and this time she wasn't looking for property records. She was looking for recurring expenses. In Nora's bank statements, there was an automatic charge of $112 every month, beginning the month she entered Riverbend and continuing regularly all the way to the present, paid to a storage company on Ogden Avenue in Cicero. Madeline had seen that charge at least 5 times over the past 4 years, and every time she had assumed it was the fee for storing what remained from the old house, a few boxes of books and the dining set she hadn't been able to bring herself to throw away. She had never gone there. At 7 o'clock that morning, she was standing at the front desk. The attendant asked for documents proving her authority as legal guardian, and fortunately she had brought everything, because 4 years had taught her that wherever she went, she needed to carry the entire file. He checked the papers, handed her an access card and a unit number. Unit 117 was in the farthest row. Inside was exactly what she had expected. The dining set covered with cloth, 6 boxes of books, 1 box of vinyl records, and the old piano from their house, standing upright beneath a tightly wrapped sheet of plastic. Madeline opened the boxes one by one. Books, more books, teaching notebooks, lesson materials, old bills, photographs. She found it in the 5th box. It was lying at the very bottom beneath a stack of music notebooks, a flat metal holiday cookie tin with a strip of yellowing masking tape still stuck across the lid. On that strip of tape were 3 words written in ballpoint pen, in her mother's handwriting, shaky and slanted in the way it had become during the final years. The 3 words were "Keep for V." Madeline lowered herself onto the concrete floor and opened the tin. The first thing inside was a handwritten musical score. She recognized it immediately. This was the original, the paper thicker and more yellowed than the photocopy in her bag. The first 3 pages, covered in her mother's handwriting, and all the erasures and corrections Madeline had known by heart since childhood, including the modulation that had been rewritten 7 times. She turned to the final page, to the measure she had spent her whole life believing was where the piece ended. It didn't end there anymore. After that measure came 8 more, written in different ink and a different hand, smaller, steadier, with a finer pen stroke, the handwriting of someone much younger. Madeline read the notes with her eyes, slowly, 1 measure at a time, and she could hear them in her head before her hands even had time to react. Those 8 measures didn't make the piece longer. They brought it home. The suspended chord her mother had left unresolved had finally been answered, and the answer was so simple it made Madeline angry, the kind of anger that comes when you watch someone solve a problem you spent your entire childhood staring at. She turned back to the first page. 3 years earlier, or perhaps longer, Someone had written a line across the top in the same ink and the same handwriting. The piece had never had a title before. Now it did. At the top of the page were 2 words. Come home. Madeline sat for a very long time with the score resting across her lap. The second thing inside the tin was a small black USB drive, unlabeled, unmarked, tied to a short length of cord. She picked it up, then put it back down. The third thing lay at the very bottom, pressed flat beneath the music, a white letter-sized envelope, sealed shut, the adhesive edge still completely intact. 4 handwritten lines covered the front, written in that same small, steady hand. The first line said, "For Garrison." The second said, "Open only if I don't come home." The third was a string of numbers, a telephone number. The fourth was a date. Madeline lifted the envelope with both hands. She was the only person in the world who knew it existed. She was sitting alone inside a locked storage unit in Cicero, with no camera inside, no one aware that she had come here, and in her hands was something that man would probably have paid any price to possess. She thought about that clearly, without pretending otherwise, because it was the thought anyone in her position would have had. All she had to do was lift one corner of the seal. Her finger was already resting against the edge of the envelope. Then she thought about what her mother had said from the chair beside the window. I put it away. I promised her. That woman had forgotten her own daughter's name for 2 years, had forgotten that she had ever owned a piano, and yet she had kept that promise for 3 years inside a cookie tin beneath a box of books. Madeline moved her hand away from the seal. She turned the envelope over so she could read the final line again, the date, November 10th. She read it once more to make certain. Then she took out her phone, opened the article from the night before, scrolled down to the date of death, and held the screen beside the envelope. The article said November 14th. The envelope said November 10th, 4 days. Vivian Ashford had written this letter, sealed it, taken it to the home of her former piano teacher in Berwyn, along with a USB drive and the score whose ending she herself had completed, and made that aging teacher promise to keep it hidden. 4 days later, she had called her husband from an underground parking garage and played that piece to him over the phone. Madeline sat motionless inside storage unit 117, holding the unopened envelope in her hands, and she understood something she wished she didn't understand. That woman had known in advance. Madeline arrived at the Vance estate at 10 o'clock that morning with the metal tin inside a cloth bag, and she went straight upstairs to the second floor without stopping anywhere. Bennett Shaw asked whether she had an appointment. She said no. He looked at the bag in her hand, then at her face, and knocked on the study door for her. Garrison was standing beside the desk with a phone pressed to his ear. He looked at her for 1 second, told the person on the other end that he would call back, and ended the call in the middle of a sentence. Madeline placed the metal tin on the desk, pushed it toward him, and said she had found it the night before in her mother's storage unit in Cicero. She said her mother had rented the unit from the day she entered Riverbend and had paid $112 a month for 4 years. Then she opened the lid and stepped back. Garrison looked inside. He took out the handwritten score first, turned one page, then turned to the final page, and stopped there for a very long time. Madeline said the last 8 measures weren't in her mother's handwriting. She said the title at the top of the page wasn't either. He said nothing. He set the score down, picked up the USB drive, held it in his palm for several seconds, then placed it beside the music. Then he took out the envelope. He read the 4 lines written across the front. He spent longer reading the date than he did the other 3 lines combined. Then he looked up at Madeline and asked whether she had opened it. She said no. He looked down at the sealed edge, turned the envelope over, examined both sides, and Madeline knew he was truly checking, not merely going through the motions. She stood still and let him. He asked why. She said because her mother had made a promise. She said the tin had been buried at the bottom of a box of books inside a locked storage unit with no cameras. No one knew she had gone there, and she had sat alone with it for nearly an hour. She said she had thought about opening it. She admitted that plainly, without trying to hide it. Then she said her mother had forgotten her own daughter's name for 2 years, had forgotten that she had ever owned a piano, and somehow she had still remembered that promise. She said if she opened the envelope, then the one thing her mother had managed to hold on to would be broken by her own daughter. Garrison placed the envelope on the desk. He told her to sit down. Madeline sat in the chair opposite him. He didn't sit. He remained standing beside the desk, slid his thumb beneath the sealed edge, opened it very slowly, and drew out 3 sheets of paper folded in half. Then he read. Madeline sat quietly and watched him. She had imagined this moment on the bus that morning, and she had imagined it completely wrong. Nothing shattered. He stood there and read the first page to the end, turned to the second, read all of it, then turned to the third. His face didn't change. His shoulders didn't change. His fingers didn't tighten around the edges of the paper. He simply stood there and read, and the stillness grew heavier with every passing second, until Madeline found herself wanting him to do something. Anything at all. He finished the third page. Then he returned to the first and read the entire letter again from the beginning. The second time, he read more slowly. When he finished it for the second time, he laid the 3 pages on the desk, smoothed the folds flat with the side of his hand, and spoke in the voice of someone reading from an official report. He said she had written that for years. Someone had been leaking information to people outside. He said she had written that she discovered it 13 months before the day she wrote the letter, that at first she thought she was mistaken, and that she had spent nearly a year checking everything before she trusted what she had found. He said she had written that she hadn't gone to anyone in the house, hadn't told the lawyer, hadn't told anyone at all, because she no longer knew whom she could trust. He said she had written that she was building a file, and that the file wasn't meant to take revenge on anyone. He stopped. Then he said she had built it to force him to leave this place. He said she had written that she had asked him to do that 3 times in 3 years, and all 3 times he had told her later. So she had decided to do it in the only way that wouldn't allow him to say later again, by putting something on his desk that would force him to choose. Madeline said nothing. He picked up the 3rd page and read the final passage aloud. He read, "You won't believe me." He read, "Because that person sits beside you every day." He read, "And I'm not planning to leave you behind. I'm planning to take you with me." Then he lowered the page. The room remained silent for a very long time. Madeline could hear a lawnmower running across the south grounds. She asked whether he knew who the person was. Garrison didn't answer. He folded the 3 pages along their original creases, returned them to the envelope, then placed the envelope back into the tin beside the score and the USB drive, and closed the lid. He thanked her. He said if she needed anything, she should tell Bennett. He said tonight was still 11 o'clock. Then he picked up the tin and walked out of his own study, leaving Madeline alone in the chair across from the empty desk, listening to his footsteps recede along the hallway, steady and even, without quickening by a single beat. That day was Thursday, and Dr. Corwin Ashby arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon for his regular examination, just as he did every 2 weeks. He stayed in the room for 40 minutes, came out, handed Bennett a new prescription, and instructed him to increase the evening dosage beginning the next day, because this latest period showed signs of getting worse. Madeline was standing at the far end of the hallway with her supply cart and heard him say it. She went back to the staff room, took the notebook from the bottom of her handbag, added another line under the column labeled "What Happened Before," then put it away again. At 11 o'clock that night, she went down to the music room, and he wasn't there. She waited 20 minutes, then played alone. The following night, she didn't see him either. On the 3rd night, exactly 40 hours after the doctor had left the house, the episode came at 11:15, just as Madeline was walking along the 2nd floor hallway. She heard the first crash and knew immediately that this wasn't like the others. The sound wasn't coming from the 3rd floor. It was coming from directly ahead of her, from the room at the end of the east corridor. She ran toward it and found the newly replaced door hanging loose from its upper hinge. Inside, everything that could be overturned had been overturned. He was standing in the middle of the room with both hands pressed hard against the sides of his head, and he was speaking to someone who wasn't there. He said, "Go ahead and say it." He said, "This time, say it. Don't play anymore. Say it." Then he brought the edge of his hand down against the piano lid once, twice, 3 times, and the instrument answered with a dull, lingering vibration. Bennett Shaw appeared behind Madeline and told her to get out immediately, that he was calling the doctor. Madeline said, "Don't call him." The butler froze. She told him to stay in the hallway, and if she called for him, then he could come in, but otherwise no one was to enter. Then she stepped into the room. She moved around Garrison, keeping her distance, righted the piano bench, and sat down. She opened the piano, placed the original handwritten score on the stand, turned to the final page, and began to play. He didn't hear her for the first 10 seconds. She kept playing. She began from the first measure, slowly, evenly, holding the pedal longer, and by the 16th measure, the pounding had stopped. She didn't turn around. She moved through the middle section, through the modulation her mother had rewritten 7 times, and from the corner of her eye she saw that he had lowered his hands from his head. She reached the measure where, for all 27 years of her life, she had always been forced to stop, the suspended cord waiting for an answer that had never been written, the measure that for 3 years had left this man stranded every night inside a silence lasting 90 seconds. She didn't stop there. She continued into Vivian's 8 measures. They weren't loud, they didn't rise. They simply descended, one step at a time, and in the final measure they returned to the exact place from which the whole piece had begun, and then they closed. The music ended. In the room, there was the sound of a man breathing, and the breathing wasn't steady. Madeline lowered her hands into her lap and sat still. She heard him sit down on the hardwood floor behind her, not collapse, but sit. Then she heard the sound. It was very quiet. It was the sound of someone who had refused to let himself make it for 3 years and could no longer hold it back, breaking from him in short, tight bursts he was still trying to suppress. Madeline didn't turn around. She remained seated at the piano with her back to him, both hands resting in her lap, and she left him that privacy. Out in the hallway, Bennett Shaw stood 3 steps from the doorway and didn't come inside either. It lasted about 10 minutes. Then there was silence. Madeline stood, closed the piano lid, and when she turned around, he was sitting with his back against the base of the wall, his head tilted back, his eyes closed, his face wet, and he made no attempt to wipe it. He spoke 1 sentence, his voice raw and hoarse. He asked where she had gotten that ending. She said it had been on the final page, inside the box. He didn't ask anything else. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling for a long time, then thanked her and stood up. He was able to stand on his own, walk to the door on his own, and at the threshold he stopped and told Bennett to go to bed, that there would be nothing else tonight. Then he went upstairs to the 3rd floor. Bennett Shaw watched him until he disappeared, then turned toward Madeline, and he said nothing. He simply stood there for a long time. The next morning, one of the daytime cleaners told Bennett that the 3rd floor bedroom was locked from the inside and no one was answering. At 9 o'clock, it was still locked. At 10, it was still locked. Bennett went upstairs and knocked 3 times over the course of that morning, and all 3 times there was no response. The 3rd time, he stopped knocking. He simply stood outside the door and listened. Then he went downstairs to the kitchen, sat down, and told the head chef that he was sleeping in his bed, and he said it twice. Garrison Vance came out of his room shortly before 7 o'clock that evening, exactly 8 hours after Bennett had knocked for the final time, and before that there had been more than 10 straight hours when no one knew anything. For 3 years, he had never slept more than 2 hours at a time, and the only time he had slept longer than that was the first stormy night, lying on the floor of the music room among the broken pieces of the doorframe. Madeline returned to her apartment at 6 o'clock in the morning and didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed with the $1.99 notebook in her hands and read all 14 entries from beginning to end. 38, 42, 36, 40, and the newest one, 40 hours. For 3 weeks, she had kept telling herself that she was only the night cleaner, and no one would believe her. That was still true, but the night before, she had sat inside that room and watched what was happening to a human being, and she understood that if she stayed silent one more time, whether anyone believed her would no longer matter. That evening, she reported for her shift an hour early. Bennett told her Garrison was in the study but had left instructions that he wasn't seeing anyone. Madeline said she wasn't asking for permission. She went upstairs to the 2nd floor, knocked twice, didn't wait for an answer, opened the door, and placed the notebook in the middle of the desk in front of him. Garrison looked at the notebook on the desk, then at her. Madeline said there were 14 entries, recorded from the day she started working there, the date and time of every episode, how long each one lasted, what was damaged, and who had come to the house during the 2 days beforehand. She said she wasn't drawing any conclusions. She had only written down what happened. She told him to read the final column. He opened the notebook and read. He finished the 1st page, turned to the next, and on the 2nd page he stopped, went back to the 1st, then began tracing each pair of entries with his finger. He did that in silence for about 5 minutes. Then he closed the notebook, picked up his phone, and called someone named Marianne Foss. She was a 51-year-old physician who specialized in trauma, had no connection whatsoever to the Vance family, and had been recommended by an attorney in Springfield with whom Garrison had never done business. The appointment took place 2 days later at her office on Wells Street, and no one at the estate knew about it. Madeline went with him because Foss herself had requested it, saying the person who had kept the records needed to be present. Garrison brought 4 things with him: the notebook, every empty medication bottle from the previous 3 months, the diagnostic file signed by 20 specialists, and the printout the police had given him 3 years earlier, the one showing 2 timestamps exactly 90 seconds apart. Foss spent the first 2 hours doing nothing but asking questions. She asked questions Madeline found strange because they didn't sound like a doctor's questions. She asked where he was during an episode, not which room of the house he was standing in, but where he was inside his own mind. She asked how old he was when it happened. She asked whether he knew if it was day or night outside. She asked whether, if someone touched him, he knew who that person was. Then she asked the final question. She asked what he heard. Garrison sat quietly for a moment, then said 4 measures of music. He said it was always those same 4 measures, never more. And after that came the 2 words he had spoken, and after those 2 words came silence. Foss put down her pen. She said there were 20 signatures in this file, and all 20 people had asked him the same question, whether he heard voices. She said he answered no, so they wrote down that there were no auditory hallucinations, then moved on to another diagnosis, then moved on again to medication. She said 20 people had examined him, and not one of them had asked what he heard. They had only asked whether he heard anything. Then she said the diagnosis that had been written in his records for the past 3 years was wrong, and it had been wrong from the very first page. She said what he had was complex trauma, that the episodes weren't outbreaks of illness but dissociative flashbacks, meaning his brain wasn't remembering that night. It was replaying it from the beginning, and the trigger was sound. She said that with this kind of condition, the first thing that needed to be treated was the memory itself, while medication was only there to help a person sleep. During the second part of the appointment, she arranged all the empty medication bottles by date and compared them against Madeline's notebook. It took 40 minutes, and for all 40 minutes, she didn't say a word. Then she looked up. She said these prescriptions weren't wrong in the way a doctor might make the wrong diagnosis and then prescribe the wrong medication. She said the dosage had been raised, then lowered, then raised again according to a regular cycle. And with this particular medication, a sudden reduction would cause severe agitation about a day and a half to 2 days later. She said every time the dosage changed, an episode followed 36 to 48 hours afterward. She said she had been practicing medicine for 24 years and had never seen a case match this precisely by accident. She said the cycle wasn't preventing the episodes, it was creating them. Madeline sat beside him and listened as the thing she had seen inside a notebook that cost $1.99 was spoken aloud by someone with medical credentials, and she felt both her hands turn cold. Garrison Vance didn't become angry. He didn't say a single word about the doctor, who had spent 40 minutes examining him every 2 weeks for 3 years. He asked Foss only one question: how the medication should be stopped. She said gradually, tapering it down over 3 weeks, with her monitoring him closely every day, and under no circumstances could the prescribing doctor be allowed to know they were stopping it, because if he knew, he would change his method. Garrison said all right. He was silent for the entire ride home. It wasn't until the car turned onto Deer Path that he told Madeline she was no longer to keep notes, that she was to give him everything she had already written, and that she wasn't to tell anyone about what happened today, not even Bennett. She asked why not even Bennett. He didn't answer. 3 days later, Garrison did something Madeline wouldn't understand until much later. He called in 3 people privately, one at a time, each meeting held in a different room, and he gave each person different information about a shipment at a port in Indiana. 3 different numbers, 3 different times, 3 different routes. He told all 3 to keep the information confidential. 9 days later, exactly one of those 3 versions appeared somewhere it should never have appeared. He knew which version it was, and he knew who he had told it to. He didn't summon anyone. He didn't tell Madeline. He didn't tell Bennett Shaw. He simply sat in the study all that night without turning on the lights. From that week forward, the monthly prescription was still delivered to the estate on schedule. Bennett still signed for it as he had for the past 3 years, still carried it upstairs and placed it on the bedside table, and still reported back to Dr. Ashby that everything was being followed exactly as prescribed. The butler did all of those things with complete honesty, because no one had told him that those pills, beginning on the 7th, were no longer being taken. The call came on the 4th day after Garrison began tapering the dosage, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the caller wasn't Riverbend. She introduced herself as someone from the customer relations department of a corporation called Meridian Care Partners. She said her company had just completed the acquisition of the entity that owned Riverbend, effective from the beginning of the month. She said that during a review of patient records, the new administration had determined that Riverbend no longer met the licensing requirements to continue caring for patients with late-stage dementia, so those patients would have to be transferred to facilities with the appropriate specialization. She said Nora Rhodes was on the transfer list. Madeline asked where she was being transferred. The woman gave her the name of a facility in Jefferson County, in the southern part of the state, more than 5 hours from Chicago by car. Madeline said she was Nora's legal guardian and she didn't consent. The woman said she was very sorry, but the decision fell under the facility's professional authority and didn't require consent from family members, though relatives had the right to file a written appeal within 30 days. Madeline asked whether her mother had already been transferred. The woman said the vehicle had left at 6 o'clock that morning. Madeline asked for the address. The woman said that under the corporation's privacy policy, the full address could only be provided after the receiving paperwork had been completed, which usually took 10 to 14 business days. Madeline stood in the kitchen of the Vance estate, with the phone pressed to her ear, and asked again, very slowly, whether she was saying that Madeline had to wait 14 days before she could even know where her mother was. The woman apologized and said yes. Over the next 4 days, Madeline made 19 calls, to the corporation, to the old facility, to the state health department, and to a free legal aid attorney in the loop. The attorney listened to her for 10 minutes, then told her to sit down, and explained that everything they had done fell within the law, that transferring patients between facilities owned by the same corporate parent happened every day in this state, that she could appeal and the process would take anywhere from 4 to 9 months, and that he was very sorry. By the 6th day, Madeline stopped calling. Bennett Shaw found her sitting on the back steps outside the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning, not crying, simply sitting there, and he stood beside her for a long time, before bringing her a cup of tea and going back inside. Sloane Whitaker came to see her on the afternoon of the 8th day, not in the garage, but at Madeline's apartment on Cermak Road. She knocked on the door, carrying a document case, and the first thing she said was, "I know what you think I came here to do, and you're wrong." Madeline let her in. Sloane placed the case on the table and said she wasn't there as the Vance family's attorney. Then she told Madeline the thing she had kept hidden for 6 years. She said her father was Theodore Whitaker, an attorney, and 11 years earlier he had taken money from a client trust account to cover losses from a failed investment. She said the man who gave him the money to bury the problem in a single night, with no paperwork, was Emmett Kerr. She said that from that moment on, her father belonged to him, and when she graduated from law school, she belonged to him too. She said that for the past 6 years she had sat inside that house to listen and to keep records. Madeline asked why she was only speaking now. Sloane said because for 6 years all she had possessed was her own word, and the word of someone like her was worth nothing. Then she opened the case. Inside were copies of transfer orders, more than 40 pages covering 9 years, moving through 3 intermediary companies. She turned to the final page and pointed to a line dated the 19th of the previous month, a transfer originating from a company called Kerrigan Holdings. She said Kerrigan Holdings was the company that had purchased the entity that owned Riverbend 2 weeks earlier. Madeline sat down. Sloane said she was very sorry that she had advised Madeline to leave the previous month, and that she had meant it sincerely at the time, because she had seen this coming. Then she said there was one more thing. She said that morning he had filed a petition with the Lake County Probate Court seeking appointment as Garrison Vance's legal guardian, accompanied by a competency evaluation signed by Dr. Corwin Ashby, and the complete 3-year medical record bearing the signatures of all 20 specialists. She said the review hearing had been scheduled for the following week, and that tomorrow night he was convening the family council at the estate, with Ottilie Vance present, to make his case before going to court. Madeline asked whether Garrison knew. Sloane said she didn't know, because for the past 3 weeks, no one had been able to tell what that man knew anymore. Then she pushed the entire document case toward Madeline and told her to take it, because if it remained in Sloane's hands, it was only the word of a debtor. But if it was in someone else's hands, it was evidence. The family council convened at 7 o'clock that evening in the grand dining room, 11 people seated around the table, with Ottilie Vance at the northern end. She was 81 years old, and she opened with a single sentence. "Whoever called this meeting speaks first." Emmett Kerr stood. He said he loved the man sitting at the southern end of the table like a brother. Then he pushed a thick file toward Ottilie and said that inside were 3 years of medical records, the signatures of 20 specialists, 27 property damage reports, and a competency evaluation signed the previous week by the primary treating physician. He said he had filed a guardianship petition with the Lake County Probate Court on Monday morning, not to take control, but to keep that man alive. Dr. Corwin Ashby stood next. He said the patient was not responding to treatment, that the episodes of agitation were becoming more frequent rather than less, and that he could not certify a man in that condition as competent to make financial decisions. Garrison Vance remained seated at the southern end of the table through all of it, and didn't say a word. When Ashby sat down, Emmett said the council needed to see it for themselves, instead of merely reading about it on paper. Then he placed his phone on the table and pressed play. Music filled the dining room. It was that piece, recorded on a phone, the sound slightly distorted. Everyone at the table turned toward the southern end. 7:38 that evening fell precisely inside the window when, for 3 years, something had always happened after every dosage adjustment. Emmett Kerr had calculated it carefully. Garrison Vance sat still. He listened through the first 4 measures. He listened through the middle section. Both hands remained resting on the tabletop, and not a single muscle in his face moved. The piece reached the suspended place where it always stopped, then went silent. No one in the room seemed to breathe too loudly. Emmett pressed play again. Garrison listened through the entire piece a second time, then reached across the table, stopped the recording, and pushed the phone back toward its owner. He said, "Today is day 11. Emmett asked. "Day 11 of what?" Garrison said. "Of not taking a single pill you prescribed." Ashby's head snapped up. Garrison placed Marianne Foss's 19-page report on the table, along with 4 months of medication bottles that had been cross-checked against the records, and the notebook containing 14 handwritten entries. He read one sentence from the report aloud, that the dosage adjustment cycle wasn't preventing the episodes, it was creating them. Then he placed more than 40 pages of transfer orders spanning 9 years on the table, and said Sloan Whitaker had agreed to provide a written statement. Emmett Kerr was still standing. He said documents could be bought, and a sick man always believed he wasn't sick. Garrison didn't answer. He reached into his jacket, took out a small black USB drive tied to a short cord, inserted it into the computer at the end of the table, and opened the only file stored on it. Music filled the room again, but this time it was a real piano, recorded in a room with an audible echo, and the person playing moved more slowly through the piece. She played it all the way to the end. Then she continued for 8 more measures no one in that room had ever heard before. When the piano stopped, there was the sound of a chair shifting, and then a woman's voice came very close to the microphone. She stated the date. November 10th. She read the names of 3 intermediary companies. She read 4 account numbers, digit by digit. Then she said that if anyone was listening to this, it meant she had not made it home, and the man they needed to find was named Emmett Kerr. The recording ended. Ottilie Vance placed both hands flat on the table. No one spoke for a very long time. Emmett Kerr sat down in his chair, and he didn't beg, didn't explain, didn't say another word. Garrison stood. He told everyone at the table that his new attorney had been working with the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois for the past 9 days, that everything from the metal tin, Foss's report, the transfer orders, and Sloan Whitaker's statement had been submitted under a proffer agreement, and that he would cooperate fully, including with the parts that implicated him personally. Someone in the middle of the table said he couldn't do that doing it would end everything. Garrison said, "I know." Then he looked toward Emmett Kerr and said, 3 years ago, she asked me to leave this place. He said, I answered her with 2 words, "Not now." He said, "Now I'm answering her." He walked out of the dining room at 9:10 that night. 3 weeks later, Emmett Kerr was arrested at his home in Winnetka on a federal warrant. That same month, the Illinois Professional Licensing Board revoked Dr. Corwin Ashby's medical license, and prosecutors charged him with fraudulent prescribing. The guardianship petition before the Lake County Probate Court was withdrawn before the review hearing could even begin. Nora Rhodes was found 6 days after the family council meeting at a facility in Jefferson County, and Madeline brought her mother back to Riverbend. Nora had no idea where she had just returned from. She only asked whether it was cold today. 3 days later, Garrison Vance came to visit her. He stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. Nora looked up, smiled politely, and asked whether he was a new student. Garrison said, "Yes, I'm a new student." She nodded and told him to sit down. Madeline opened the old piano in the room, placed the original handwritten score on the stand, and began to play. By the 12th measure, another sound joined the music. Nora was humming along, very softly, with both hands resting open in her lap and her eyes still turned toward the window. She hummed through even the modulation she herself had revised 7 times on that page. Then Madeline reached the suspended measure and continued into the final 8 measures, the 8 measures her mother had never written. Nora hummed every one of those 8 measures with her, without missing a single note. Madeline stopped playing and didn't dare turn around. Behind her, Garrison Vance lowered himself to his knees beside the wheelchair, rested his forehead against the arm of the chair, and cried. Nora reached out and patted his shoulder twice, the same way she had comforted hundreds of children who missed a note during 40 years of teaching. She said, "It's all right, sweetheart. You can always start again from the beginning." There were no miracles in the months that followed. Garrison continued treatment with Dr. Marianne Foss exactly as prescribed, 1 session every week, and he never missed a single appointment. The episodes became less frequent and less severe, but they didn't disappear completely. There were still nights when he woke at 3 o'clock in the morning. The difference was that now he called Foss the next morning, and he could talk about what had happened. One afternoon in February, Ottilie Vance asked Madeline to come see her, and gave her Vivian's ring, along with the 3rd page of the letter, the page Garrison had never read aloud to her. Vivian had written that if one day someone came along who could make him sit still with himself, then he shouldn't be stubborn, because he had never been very good at that. In March, the DePaul School of Music accepted Madeline back to complete her final year on a full scholarship. She held the acceptance letter for 3 days without telling anyone. Garrison was the one who spoke first. He asked when she planned to leave. She said she hadn't decided. He told her to go. He said that all his life, he had never let go of anything he wanted to keep, and he said it calmly, then added that once before, he had kept someone beside him because he needed her, and he wouldn't do that a second time. 14 months later, Madeline's graduation recital took place in a small auditorium in Lincoln Park. On the printed program, the final performance listed the title first, "Come Home," and beneath it were 2 names, Nora Rhodes and Vivian Vance. 3 people sat in the front row, Ottilie, Garrison, and a woman in a wheelchair who didn't know where she was, but still hummed along. That night, they returned to the room at the end of the east hallway, the room where a night maid had once pushed open a forbidden door in the middle of a storm. Madeline sat down at the piano, and this time he sat beside her, not to listen, but to turn the pages for her. He didn't know how to play the piano and never would, but he was there. When she finished the final 8 measures, he didn't applaud. He said her name, her full name, Madeline Rhodes, exactly the way she had spoken it herself in this room on the 21st night, and then he asked whether she would stay with him for the rest of their lives. This story leaves us with 3 things. First, the person everyone in that house walked past without a second glance, the person no one even bothered to ask her name for 21 days, was the only person who saw the truth. We are so accustomed to measuring a person's worth by the uniform they wear that we often overlook the very people who might one day save us. Second, pain that no one is willing to listen to will eventually be called madness. 20 specialists looked at that man as though he were nothing more than a medical file. They asked whether he heard anything, wrote down his answer, and moved on. Only one person sat with him long enough to ask what he heard. Sometimes what a human being needs isn't advice, but someone willing to stay long enough to truly listen. And third, the words "not now" may be the most expensive words a person ever says. Some calls come only once. Some things can only be said while the other person is still there to hear them. If this story touched you, please leave a like and share it with the person you're thinking about right now. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can hear more meaningful stories every day. And I'd like to know how this story made you feel. Did you see a part of your own life somewhere inside it? Have you ever said "not now" to someone and later discovered that you never had another chance to say what you truly meant? Write a few lines in the comments. I read every comment, and I would truly love to hear what is resting deep inside your heart. I wish you and your family good health, happiness, peace, and calm in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.